As a child, my grandmother's house was my favorite place in the world. Nestled in the countryside, it was a sprawling old Victorian home with creaky floorboards and a sense of history that wrapped around you like a warm blanket. My favorite part was the attic, a treasure trove of forgotten trinkets and dusty antiques. Grandma would let me explore up there for hours, rummaging through the old boxes and cabinets. Among the many curiosities was a doll that I had named Lila. She was porcelain with delicate painted features and dark, glossy hair styled in tight ringlets. Her eyes were a shade of green that almost seemed alive, and her lips curled in a faint, enigmatic smile. Lila was different from the other dolls in Grandma's collection. She was pristine, as if time had never touched her. Despite her beauty, something about her always made me uneasy. Her gaze seemed to follow me no matter where I stood in the room. One summer, I decided to take Lila home with me. Grandma was hesitant at first. "She's been in the family for generations," she said. "Treat her carefully." I assured her I would, though I couldn't explain why I felt compelled to take Lila. Something about her fascinated me, even as she unnerved me. At home, I placed Lila on a shelf in my bedroom, her green eyes seemingly fixed on my bed. That night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I thought I heard whispering. It was faint, like the rustling of leaves, but unmistakable. I sat up, heart pounding. My room was silent except for the gentle hum of the ceiling fan. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was just spooked by the move and the strange atmosphere of my grandmother's doll. The whispering became a nightly occurrence. Sometimes I'd hear faint giggles or the soft creak of the floorboards, as if someone were walking around. The whispers were incomprehensible, but they always seemed to come from Lila's direction. One night I woke up to find Lila no longer on the shelf. She was sitting at the foot of my bed, her green eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at her, frozen in fear. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The room was silent. Slowly, I reached out and picked Lila up, her porcelain surface cold against my skin. I placed her back on the shelf, determined to find a logical explanation for what had just happened. But things only got worse. Objects in my room began to move on their own, a book falling off a desk, a chair shifting slightly out of place. At night, I'd hear the whispers grow louder, more distinct. "Come play," a voice said one night, clear and childlike. I bolted upright, my eyes darting around the room. Lila was still on the shelf, her gaze fixed on me. Desperate, I decided to confront my grandmother. She listened quietly as I recounted everything, her face growing paler with each word. "I didn't want to tell you this," she said, her voice trembling. "Lila belonged to my sister, Eleanor. She passed away when she was just a child. Lila was her favorite toy." "What happened to her?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "She drowned in the lake behind our house," Grandma said, tears welling up in her eyes. "After she died, strange things started happening. The doll would move on its own, just like you said. We thought it was Eleanor trying to communicate with us." I stared at her, my heart racing. "So what do? I can't keep her." Grandma hesitated before nodding. "We need to put her back where she belongs." That evening, we returned to Grandma's house. The attic was just as I remembered, though it felt darker and colder than before. We placed Lila in the glass cabinet where she had always been, her green eyes staring at us as if she knew. For a moment, the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. Then, just as suddenly, it lifted. The whispers stopped, and the room grew still. I left Lila behind that night, but the memory of her haunted me. To this day, I sometimes dream of her green eyes and that faint, haunting smile. Years later, Grandma passed away and the house was sold. I never went back to see Lila, though sometimes when I'm alone, I think I hear faint whispers in the wind, soft, childlike giggles that send shivers down my spine. Growing up in a small, close-knit town, I always passed by the abandoned workshop of Henry Whitmore, the famed doll maker. It was a narrow brick building tucked away at the edge of Main Street, with its cracked windows and faded sign reading, "Whitmore's Dolls." The townsfolk had plenty of stories about Henry. Some said he was a genius, crafting dolls so lifelike they seemed to breathe. Others whispered that he was cursed, and his obsession with perfection ultimately drove him mad. His shop had been locked up for decades, and no one dared to venture inside. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and when my best friend Lily suggested we explore the shop one summer evening, I couldn't resist. The door creaked as we pushed it open, the musty air rushing out to greet us. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. The workshop was exactly as Henry had left it. Half-finished dolls scattered on the workbenches, jars of paint and brushes lined neatly on the shelves, and sewing needles still stuck in rolls of fabric. At the center of the room was a glass cabinet filled with dolls. They were exquisite, their porcelain faces painted with delicate features, their eyes gleaming as though alive. One doll in particular caught my eye. She was larger than the others, dressed in a crimson gown with lace trim. Her jet black hair was styled in an elegant bun, and her piercing blue eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. "She's beautiful," Lily said, reaching out to touch the glass. A sudden chill ran down my spine. "Let's not," I said, pulling her hand back. But Lily was always the braver one. She opened the cabinet and carefully lifted the doll out, cradling it in her arms like a child. The moment she did, a strange energy filled the room. The air grew heavy, the shadows in the corners deepened, and an unsettling stillness fell over us. "We should put her back," I said, my voice trembling. "Relax," Lily replied, laughing nervously. "It's just a doll." But it wasn't. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I had taken a different doll from the workshop, a smaller one with a simple white dress and brown curls. I had thought it would be a harmless souvenir, but now I wasn't so sure. As I lay in bed, the doll sat on my desk, its button eyes glinting faintly in the moonlight. I could have sworn it moved slightly, just enough to make me question my sanity. Then I heard the whispers. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of overlapping voices. "Why did you take us?" I bolted upright, my heart pounding. The doll was no longer on the desk. It was sitting on the floor, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Panic set in. I grabbed the doll, ran to the backyard, and threw it into the trash bin. I didn't sleep that night, haunted by the whispers and the memory of those lifeless button eyes. The next morning, I found the doll back on my desk, its head turned toward me. Desperate, I called Lily, only to discover she was experiencing something far worse. She told me the crimson-dressed doll had begun to appear in her dreams, whispering in her ear and moving on its own. "We need to take them back," she said, her voice shaking. "We should never have taken them." We returned to the workshop that evening, carrying the dolls in trembling hands. As we stepped inside, the atmosphere was even darker than before. The air felt charged with an unspoken anger, and the shadows seemed to pulse with life. We placed the dolls back in the cabinet, but the moment we did, the door slammed shut behind us. A cold wind swirled through the room, and the dolls in the cabinet began to shift, their heads turning to watch us. The largest doll, the one in the crimson gown, raised its porcelain hand and pointed at us. "Leave," a voice echoed, deep and resonant, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted out of the workshop, not daring to look back. The next day, the workshop had changed. The glass in the windows was no longer cracked, and the sign above the door shone as though freshly painted. The cabinet inside was empty, its shelves pristine. No one believed us when we told them what had happened. The workshop remains abandoned, its doors locked tight. But sometimes when I pass by, I swear I hear faint whispers through the cracked windows. And on the rare occasions I dare to look inside, I see them, the dolls, watching, waiting for their next visitors. When my husband Sam and I purchased our first home, we knew it would be a project. It was a charming colonial-style house, tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. Despite its peeling paint and creaky floors, it had character, a warmth we felt the moment we walked through the door. The attic was what sold me. It was spacious, with a large, circular window that bathed the room in soft light. While exploring the house on the day we moved in, I stumbled upon an old wooden chest tucked into a corner of the attic. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened it to find a single item, a doll. She was about 2 feet tall, her body made of cloth and her face painted porcelain. Her hair, though faded, was a brilliant auburn, and she wore a blue dress with a lace collar. Her glassy eyes seemed to shimmer, catching the light in a way that made them almost lifelike. I showed her to Sam, who raised an eyebrow. "Creepy," he said, laughing, "but she looks expensive." "She's beautiful," I replied, though there was something about her that gave me pause. We placed the doll on a shelf in the living room, thinking she would make an interesting conversation piece. That night, as we sat on the couch unpacking boxes, I felt a strange sensation, like we weren't alone. Every time I glanced at the doll, I swore her position had changed slightly, her head tilted a little more, her arms resting differently. "Do you think she's weird?" I asked Sam, trying to sound casual. "She's just a doll," he replied. "Don't overthink it." But I couldn't help it. Over the next few days, the doll seemed to move more noticeably. Once I found her lying on the couch, as if she had been watching TV. Another time she was in the kitchen, perched on a chair. "Sam, are you messing with me?" I asked one evening, holding the doll in my hands. He frowned. "What are you talking about?" "She's moving," I said. "I keep finding her in different places." Sam shook his head. "You probably just forgot where you put her. You've been stressed." I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew something was wrong. That night I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were faint but distinct, echoing through the house. I nudged Sam awake, and we both listened. The footsteps stopped outside our bedroom door. "Stay here," Sam whispered, grabbing a baseball bat from under the bed. He crept to the door and flung it open. The hallway was empty. "See?" he said, trying to reassure me. "It's just the old house settling." But as he turned to close the door, we both froze. The doll was sitting at the top of the stairs, her glassy eyes fixed on us. "How did she get there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Sam picked up the doll and carried her back to the living room. "We're getting rid of her tomorrow," he said firmly. The next morning, we placed the doll in a box and drove to a donation center. I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt as we handed her over. For a week, everything was normal. The house felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. But then, one night, I heard the familiar sound of footsteps again. This time, They were accompanied by a soft, childlike giggle. Terrified, I turned on every light in the house. At the bottom of the stairs was the doll, her blue dress torn, her glassy eyes staring up at me. Sam and I decided we had to destroy her. We took her to the backyard, poured gasoline over her, and set her on fire. The flames roared to life, consuming her delicate features. But as the fire died down, we were horrified to see the doll intact, her porcelain face untouched, her glassy eyes still shimmering. We buried her in the woods that night, far from our home. Since then, the footsteps and giggles have stopped, but I still feel her presence sometimes, watching, waiting. And when I close my eyes at night, I see her face, smiling faintly as if she knows she'll find her way back. It began, innocently enough, with a yard sale on the outskirts of town. Sam and I had a lazy Saturday free, and we decided to browse for unique pieces to decorate our new home. The house hosting the sale was old, its shutters hanging loosely, and the lawn dotted with tables full of antiques and oddities. Toward the back of the yard, hidden under a pile of quilts, I found her. The doll was exquisite, her face crafted from smooth porcelain, her lips painted a soft rose. Her gown was a deep emerald green with intricate gold embroidery, and her black hair was braided elegantly. But it was her eyes that captivated me, bright green, almost unnervingly lifelike. "You have a good eye," the elderly woman running the sale said as she approached. Her smile was warm, but her eyes betrayed a hint of something I couldn't place. "How much for her?" I asked. The woman hesitated. "She's special," she said. "She belonged to my grandmother, who believed she was a protector of sorts." I laughed softly, assuming she was joking. "I'll take her," I said, handing over a $20 bill. As we drove home, Sam glanced at the doll in my lap. "She's kind of creepy, don't you think?" "She's beautiful," I replied, brushing off his comment. Once home, I placed the doll on a shelf in our living room, where she immediately became a focal point. Visitors complimented her, though a few admitted she made them uneasy. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Shadows seemed to linger around the doll longer than they should, and her green eyes seemed to follow me, no matter where I stood. Then the dreams started. In my dreams, the doll was alive, her tiny porcelain feet clicking on the hardwood floor as she moved through the house. She would stand at the foot of our bed, staring silently until I woke, drenched in sweat. Sam didn't believe me when I told him. "You've been watching too many horror movies," he teased. But one night, he woke me with a panicked shout. "I saw her," he gasped. "She was standing by the door." We both stared at the doll, sitting innocently on her shelf. Her expression seemed different, though, almost smug, as if she were mocking us. Determined to put an end to the madness, we decided to get rid of her. We placed her in a box and drove to a nearby thrift store. I felt a pang of guilt as we left her there, but relief quickly followed. That night, we slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Until the morning came. Sam found her first, sitting on the kitchen counter. How did she get here?" he stammered. I had no answer. We hadn't told anyone about the doll, and the thrift store was miles away. Desperate, we turned to the elderly woman who had sold her to us. "I warned you," she said gravely when we returned to her house. "She doesn't like to be abandoned." "What do we do?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. The woman handed me a small, weathered journal. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said. "It contains a ritual to appease her, but be warned, it doesn't always work. That night, Sam and I followed the instructions in the journal. We lit candles, chanted words in a language we didn't understand, and placed the doll in a circle of salt. For a moment, it seemed to work. The air in the room grew still, and the doll's green eyes seemed to dim. Then, with a sound like shattering glass, the candles extinguished themselves, and the doll's eyes glowed brighter than ever. A cold wind whipped through the room, and I heard a voice, a soft, melodic whisper. "You cannot get rid of me," it said. The doll's porcelain lips moved as she spoke, her tiny hands twitching. We fled the house that night, leaving everything behind. To this day, the house remains abandoned, the doll sitting on her shelf, waiting for the next unlucky soul to claim her as their own. When my grandmother passed away, she left me her most cherished possession, a doll she called Annalise. She had kept it on a pedestal in her living room for as long as I could remember, always warning me never to touch it. "She's special," Grandma used to say with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "She keeps the family safe." As a child, I found Annalise fascinating. Her porcelain face was painted with delicate features, and her bright blue eyes sparkled with an almost human intelligence. Her dress was a masterpiece of lace and satin, perfectly preserved despite its age. But now, as I held the doll in my hands, I felt a chill run through me. There was something unnerving about her presence, a weight that seemed to press down on the air around her. Still, I couldn't bring myself to throw her away. She was a part of my family, a piece of my grandmother's legacy. So I placed her on a shelf in my bedroom and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that crept over me whenever I looked at her. The first night Annalise stayed with me, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind outside seemed amplified, filling my mind with images of her porcelain face watching me in the darkness. When I woke the next morning, the doll was no longer on the shelf. I found her sitting in the armchair across the room, her blue eyes fixed on the bed. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had moved her and forgotten, but deep down I knew I hadn't. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Lights flickered, doors creaked open on their own, and I often felt the sensation of being watched. Annalise seemed to move when I wasn't looking, her position changing subtly from one moment to the next. One night, I heard faint laughter, high, pitched and childlike, coming from the corner of my room. When I turned on the light, Annalise was sitting on the floor, her head tilted as if she were listening to something only she could hear. I called my best friend Maya for help. "You need to get rid of that doll," Maya said firmly when she saw Annalise. "It's not normal." But when we tried to take her outside to throw her away, the power in the house went out. The darkness was suffocating and the air grew icy cold. Then the laughter started again, louder this time, echoing through the house. Terrified, we dropped the doll and ran. The next morning, I found her sitting on the kitchen counter as if nothing had happened. Her blue eyes seemed to gleam with amusement. Desperate for answers, I began researching Annalise's history. I found an old photograph of my grandmother as a child, holding the doll. In the picture, Grandma looked pale and frightened, her smile forced. Digging deeper, I discovered stories of similar dolls, heirlooms passed down through generations, each tied to tragedy. The dolls were said to house spirits, binding themselves to families and feeding on their fear. I confronted my mother about the doll's origins. She hesitated before finally admitting the truth. "Your grandmother believed Annalise protected us," she said, "but she also warned that we could never let her go. If we tried, she would come back, angrier. I felt a surge of anger and despair. Why had this burden been passed to me? That night I made a decision. If Annalise was tied to our family, then I would face her head on. I placed her in the middle of a salt circle, surrounded by candles, and began reciting a banishment spell I had found online. The room grew cold, and the flames of the candles flickered violently. Annalise's blue eyes seemed to glow, and I heard the laughter again, closer this time. Then the candles went out. In the darkness, I felt something brush against my arm, cold and delicate, like porcelain fingers. When the lights came back on, Annalise was gone. For weeks the house felt lighter, as if a dark cloud had lifted, but every so often I feel her presence, a fleeting shadow, a faint laugh in the distance. I know she's still out there, waiting, and one day she'll come back. The doll arrived in an unmarked box on my doorstep, its only label a scrawled note that read, "For Lydia, keep her safe." I had no idea who sent it. The handwriting was unfamiliar and there was no return address. Inside, nestled in crumpled newspaper, was the most peculiar doll I had ever seen. She was tall for a doll, nearly 2 feet, with glassy black eyes, pale porcelain skin, and a hand-sewn dress made of faded velvet and lace. A pang of unease settled in my stomach as I examined her, but curiosity overrode my discomfort. She looked old, possibly antique, and I wondered if she might be valuable. I placed her on the fireplace mantel in the living room, thinking she might add a touch of vintage charm. But from the moment she entered my home, things began to change. The first sign was the noise. Late at night, I'd hear faint tapping sounds, like someone drumming their fingers against the walls. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling or the wind rattling the windows, but the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, always seeming to come from the room where the doll sat. Then objects began moving on their own. A glass I had left on the coffee table would appear in the kitchen sink. Books fell from shelves with no apparent cause. The doll's head, which I was sure had been facing forward, would sometimes be turned slightly, as if she were looking at something, or someone, in the room. The turning point came one night when I was home alone. I had just settled into bed when I heard it, a soft, high-pitched humming. It was a melody I didn't recognize, and it sent chills down my spine. I tiptoed downstairs, heart pounding, and found the doll sitting on the mantel, her black eyes gleaming in the dim light. The humming stopped the moment I entered the room. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I decided to get rid of the doll the next morning, but she wouldn't leave. When I placed her in a trash bag and set it by the curb, I found her back on the mantel within an hour. I tried leaving her at a thrift store, but she reappeared on my coffee table the next morning, her velvet dress spotless, despite the dusty shelves where I had abandoned her. Desperate, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in the occult. When I showed him the doll, his face went pale. "This is no ordinary doll," he said. "She's a companion. These were often used in rituals to house spirits, keeping them bound to a physical object. If she's attached to you, it means someone intended for her to be in your care." "What does she want?" I asked, my voice trembling. He shook his head. "That depends on the spirit. Some companions are protectors, but others..." He trailed off, his expression grim. I left his office more unsettled than ever. That night, the humming returned, louder and closer than before. I woke to find the doll sitting on my bedside table, her glassy eyes staring straight into mine. "Who sent you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. To my horror, the doll's head tilted slightly as if acknowledging my question. The next day, I searched my house for any clue about her origin. In the attic, buried beneath old photo albums, I found a faded letter addressed to my late grandmother. It was from her sister, who I had never met. The letter spoke of a family curse, a pact made generations ago to protect our bloodline. The doll, it seemed, was part of that pact, a vessel meant to contain the spirit of a protector, or perhaps something darker. I tried one final ritual to sever my connection to her, using instructions I found in an ancient book. The air in the room grew thick as I chanted, the doll's black eyes seeming to burn into me. When the ritual ended, she was gone. For weeks I felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted. But late one night, I heard the humming again, faint but unmistakable. I know she'll be back. She always comes back. When I first saw Evangeline, she was sitting in the window of a dusty little antique shop I had never noticed before. Her glass eyes seemed to follow me as I walked past, her delicate porcelain face frozen in a faint, knowing smile. I wasn't planning to buy anything that day, but something about her compelled me to step inside. The shopkeeper, a frail old man with a thick accent, smiled when I pointed at the doll. "Ah, Evangeline," he said. "She's been waiting for someone like you." "Someone like me?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "She chooses who she belongs to," he said cryptically. "Are you sure you want her?" The way he asked made my skin crawl, but the price was surprisingly low, and I had always loved vintage items. I decided to take her home. From the moment Evangeline entered my apartment, the atmosphere shifted. At first, it was subtle, a chill in the air despite the warm summer weather, the faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow her. I placed her on a shelf in the living room, thinking she would be a charming conversation piece. That night, I woke to the sound of faint footsteps. Groggy and confused, I sat up, straining to listen. My apartment was small and I lived alone. There shouldn't have been anyone else there. The sound stopped, and I convinced myself it was just my imagination. But when I walked into the living room the next morning, Evangeline was no longer on the shelf. She was sitting on the coffee table, her glass eyes fixed on the couch, as if she had been waiting for me to sit down. I laughed nervously, trying to brush off the unease creeping up my spine. I must have moved her and forgotten, I told myself. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. Over the next few days, more strange things happened. I'd leave a light on in the kitchen, only to find it off when I returned. Doors I had closed would be ajar, and objects seemed to shift positions when I wasn't looking. Evangeline's placement became a constant mystery. No matter where I left her, she always turned up somewhere else, sitting on my bed, perched on the counter, once even propped against the bathroom mirror. I started having vivid nightmares. In one, I was trapped in a room full of dolls, all with Evangeline's face. They whispered in unison, their voices rising to a deafening crescendo. I would wake up drenched in sweat, her faint, lavender scent lingering in the air. One evening, my best friend Sarah came over. As soon as she saw the doll, she frowned. "There's something off about her," Sarah said. "Where did you get this?" I told her about the antique shop and the strange old man. Sarah shook her head. "You need to get rid of it. Dolls like this are never just dolls." I wanted to believe her, but every time I tried to leave Evangeline outside or throw her away, she reappeared in my apartment, her position more menacing each time. Desperate, I returned to the antique shop, but it was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. That night, I decided to confront Evangeline. I sat her down on the coffee table and stared into her unblinking eyes. "What do you want from me?" I asked aloud, my voice trembling. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and the faint scent of lavender grew overpowering. The lights flickered, and I heard a soft, childlike giggle. When the room went dark, I felt a tiny hand brush against mine. When the lights came back on, Evangeline was gone. I thought it was over, but the next morning she was back on the shelf, her head tilted at an angle that almost looked mocking. Since then I've tried everything, burning her, burying her, even consulting a spiritual advisor. Nothing works. Evangeline always finds her way back, her glass eyes glinting with a malevolent intelligence. I don't know how to escape her, but one thing is certain. She's not just a doll. She's something far worse, and she's not done with me yet. The day I found the doll, I had been helping my aunt clean out the attic of her century-old farmhouse. It was a blisteringly hot afternoon, and the thick, stagnant air in the attic made every breath feel like a chore. Amid the clutter of dusty boxes and forgotten trinkets, I noticed a trunk pushed into a corner. Its brass lock had long since rusted, and the wood was brittle and warped. Something about it felt off, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside I found her. The doll was exquisite, yet unsettling. She was dressed in a crimson gown, the fabric rich and vibrant despite the passage of time. Her eyes were made of some kind of polished glass, unnervingly lifelike, and her porcelain face bore a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. I called my aunt over to show her, but the moment she saw the doll, her face paled. "You found her?" she whispered, as if speaking louder might awaken something. "Who is she?" I asked, confused by her reaction. My aunt hesitated before replying. "That's Isabella. She belonged to my grandmother, but we were told never to take her out of the trunk. She's not just a toy." I laughed nervously. "She's a doll, Aunt Margie. What harm could she do?" But my aunt didn't laugh. Instead, she told me to put the doll back and forget I had ever seen her. I didn't listen. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn to Isabella. She was beautiful, unique, surely worth something to a collector. Ignoring my aunt's warnings, I packed the doll into my car and brought her home. That night, the dreams began. In the first, I was standing in a ballroom, surrounded by faceless figures in Victorian attire. Isabella was there too, but she was no longer a doll. She was a young woman, her crimson dress shimmering under the chandelier's light. She reached out to me, her lips forming silent words I couldn't understand. When I woke up, the doll was sitting on my nightstand, even though I had left her in the living room. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Lights flickered, cold spots appeared in random corners of the house, and I heard faint whispers in the dead of night. Each time I tried to ignore the signs, they grew worse. Isabella's position kept changing too. I'd leave her on the bookshelf, only to find her in the kitchen or propped against the bathroom mirror. Once I found her lying on my bed, her glassy eyes fixed on my pillow. I called my aunt, desperate for answers. "I warned you," she said, her voice trembling. "Isabella isn't just a doll, she's a vessel, a gateway." My grandmother used her in rituals, calling on spirits for guidance and protection. But one night, something else came through, something dark. That's why she was locked away. Then what do I do? I asked, panic creeping into my voice. You have to return her, my aunt said. Bury her back where she was found and never look for her again. But it was too late. That night, the whispers turned to screams and shadows moved on their own. I woke to find the word "stay" scratched into the wall above my bed, the paint chipped away as if by tiny, clawed hands. When I tried to drive back to my aunt's farmhouse the next morning, my car wouldn't start. The doll sat in the passenger seat, her crimson dress pristine and her smirk more pronounced than ever. I tried to destroy her, burning, smashing, even submerging her in water. But no matter what I did, Isabella remained intact, her lifelike eyes gleaming with something that felt like mockery. Now I'm trapped. She's everywhere I go, her presence inescapable. I've stopped sleeping, stopped leaving the house. The shadows have grown bolder, and the whispers are no longer confined to the night. I know she's waiting for something, though I don't know what. All I know is that I made a mistake, and now I'm paying the price. Isabella doesn't just want to stay, she wants me. And I don't think I have much time left. It all began on a rainy afternoon when I stumbled upon a peculiar thrift store tucked into the corner of a quiet street. The shop was dimly lit, filled with an assortment of vintage odds and ends, each with its own layer of dust and mystery. As I wandered aimlessly, my eyes fell upon a small, delicate doll seated on a high shelf. She was beautiful in a haunting way, dressed in an old-fashioned lace gown, her hair an elaborate cascade of curls. But what struck me most were her eyes, painted a soft blue, yet they seemed to shimmer with a strange, lifelike quality. "Clara," a voice said behind me, startling me. I turned to see the shopkeeper, an elderly woman with sharp features and a voice as fragile as glass. "That's her name," she explained, her gaze lingering on the doll. "She's been here for years. No one seems to want her." Something about the way she said it sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't deny the doll's allure. On impulse, I decided to take her home. The moment Clara entered my apartment, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air felt heavier, and the faint scent of roses filled the room. I placed her on the mantel above the fireplace, thinking she would make an interesting conversation piece. That night, I was jolted awake by the sound of humming. It was soft, almost melodic, and it seemed to be coming from the living room. Grabbing my phone for light, I crept out of bed, my heart pounding. The humming grew louder as I approached, but when I turned on the light, the room was empty. Clara, however, was no longer on the mantel. She was sitting upright on the coffee table, her painted eyes staring straight at me. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself that I must have moved her and forgotten. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences multiplied. Lights flickered, objects disappeared, only to reappear in odd places, and the faint humming became a nightly ritual. Each time I heard it, it sent chills down my spine, as if the melody carried some ancient sorrow. One evening, I invited my friend James over, desperate for some rational perspective. The moment he saw Clara, his expression darkened. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice unusually serious. I explained about the thrift store, and his frown deepened. "I've seen something like this before. Dolls like her aren't just toys, they're conduits, links to the other side." "Don't be ridiculous," I scoffed, though his words unsettled me. James stayed the night, and we decided to test Clara's presence by placing her in a locked cabinet. We both agreed that if she moved, it would be proof of something unnatural. At 3 a.m., we were awoken by a loud crash. Rushing into the living room, we found the cabinet door wide open, its lock shattered. Clara sat on the floor amidst the broken pieces, her head tilted as if mocking us. "I'm done," James said, grabbing his coat. "Get rid of her, or she'll destroy you." But getting rid of Clara wasn't so simple. I tried donating her, leaving her at the thrift store, even burying her in the woods. Yet every time she found her way back, always appearing in my apartment with that faint scent of roses and her hauntingly lifelike eyes. Desperate, I turned to a medium, a kind woman named Evelyn who claimed to specialize in haunted objects. The moment she saw Clara, Evelyn paled. "This doll carries the spirit of a child," she said, her voice trembling. "But something else has latched onto her, something dark." Evelyn performed a cleansing ritual, chanting prayers and burning herbs. For a moment, the air felt lighter, the room warmer. But then Clara's head turned, ever so slightly, and a chilling laugh echoed through the apartment. Evelyn screamed, clutching her chest as the room plunged into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, Clara was gone. But so was Evelyn. Since that night, the humming has stopped, and Clara hasn't reappeared, but I know she's not gone. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I catch a faint whiff of roses or hear the soft echo of a melody long forgotten. She's waiting, biding her time, and I fear that when she returns, it will be for good. It will. When I inherited my grandmother's house, I didn't think much of the dusty, old chest tucked into the corner of her sewing room. The house itself was a relic, with creaky floorboards and a faint, musty smell that clung to everything. I had plans to renovate it, but first, I needed to clear out the clutter that had accumulated over decades. The chest was unassuming, locked with a rusted latch that broke easily under the pressure of a crowbar. Inside, I found a collection of porcelain dolls, each more intricately detailed than the last. One doll in particular caught my attention. She was unlike the others, her porcelain face painted with care, her eyes a piercing green that seemed to follow me no matter where I stood. Her hair was an unnervingly realistic shade of auburn, and she wore a deep blue dress adorned with tiny, hand-sewn pearls. I wasn't sure why, but I decided to keep her. Maybe it was nostalgia, or perhaps it was the craftsmanship. Either way, I set her on the fireplace mantel in the living room and continued my work. The first night, I thought I heard faint laughter. It was soft, almost childlike, echoing through the house as I lay in bed. I chalked it up to the wind or the creaks of the old house, but when I went downstairs the next morning, the doll wasn't on the mantel. She was on the couch, sitting upright as if waiting for someone. I stared at her for a long moment before picking her up and placing her back on the mantel. It was strange, but I told myself I must have moved her and forgotten. By the third night, I couldn't deny something was wrong. The laughter returned, louder this time, and it was accompanied by the sound of footsteps, small, deliberate steps that stopped just outside my bedroom door. "Hello!" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, only silence. I barely slept that night, and when morning came, I decided to do some research. I scoured the internet for anything that could explain the doll's behavior, eventually stumbling upon an old newspaper article. It detailed the story of a man named Victor Leroux, a renowned doll maker who had lived in the town over a century ago. Victor had been accused of using dark magic to imbue his dolls with life, and after a string of mysterious deaths, the townsfolk burned his workshop to the ground. The article mentioned that only one of Victor's dolls had survived the fire, a doll described as having green eyes and an auburn wig. My stomach churned. The doll on my mantel matched the description perfectly. Determined to rid myself of her, I tried everything. I threw her in the trash, only to find her back on the mantel the next morning. I burned her, but the flames refused to touch her. No matter what I did, she always returned, unscathed and eerily silent. One night, out of sheer desperation, I placed her in the chest she came from and locked it tight. As I turned to leave the room, I heard a soft, muffled giggle from inside the chest. The next day, I reached out to an antiques dealer in town, hoping they might take the doll off my hands. The moment the dealer saw her, he recoiled. "Get rid of it," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "That doll is cursed. It's tied to Victor LaRue, and it won't stop until it claims what it wants." "What does it want?" I asked, my throat dry. The dealer didn't answer, but his silence was more telling than any words could have been. That night, the laughter returned, accompanied by whispers in a language I couldn't understand. Shadows danced across the walls, and the air grew cold enough to see my breath. When I turned to look at the mantel, the doll wasn't there. She was standing at the foot of my bed. Her green eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and for the first time, her porcelain lips moved. "Play with me," she said, her voice sweet and childlike. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, it was morning, and the doll was gone. But I know she's not far. Sometimes I hear the faint echo of laughter or see a shadow that doesn't belong. Victor LaRue's curse isn't broken, and I fear it never will be. I never believed in ghosts or curses, at least not until I moved into the old house on Maple Street. It was a charming Victorian-style house, weathered by time but full of character. My husband and I bought it on a whim, seeking a fresh start after the hustle of city life. But soon I'd come to realize that there were things in that house that shouldn't have been there. One rainy afternoon, while exploring the attic, I found an old wooden chest hidden beneath a pile of dusty blankets. It was small and unremarkable, its surface scarred by years of neglect. I couldn't help but feel a pull toward it, a curiosity that seemed to come from deep within. I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking as though protesting the intrusion. Inside, nestled on a faded velvet cushion, was a doll. She was a porcelain doll, delicate and eerie in her appearance. Her hair was a tangled mess of dark curls, her dress frayed and stained with age. But what caught my attention were her eyes, wide and unblinking, painted in a shade of brown that seemed almost too lifelike. It felt as if she were staring straight into my soul. I was repulsed, but fascinated at the same time. I decided to clean her up and place her on a shelf in the living room. Something about her unsettled me, but I couldn't bear the thought of throwing her away. That night, as I sat in the living room with my husband, I swore I heard soft giggles coming from the corner. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the sound persisted. I stood up to investigate, and as I approached the shelf, I froze. The doll was gone. I checked every room, every closet, but there was no sign of her. I assumed it was just another weird quirk of the house, settling, drafts, or perhaps I had simply misplaced her. But when I went to bed that night, I found the doll sitting at the foot of our bed, staring at me with those same lifeless eyes. The next morning, I called a local antiques expert. He came to the house to take a look at the doll, but as soon as he laid eyes on her, his face went pale. "This doll, it's not like the others," he whispered. "This isn't just a doll. It was made by a woman named Marguerite Baines. She was known for creating dolls that could trap a piece of the soul. Legend has it she lost her own child many years ago and began making dolls to bring them back. I shuddered at the thought. I wanted to believe it was just an old superstition, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. That night, the giggling returned, but this time it was louder, more insistent. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with the thought of what might be lurking in the dark corners of my home. I tried to leave the house the next morning, but as I went to gather my things, I found the doll once again, sitting on the kitchen table, its cold eyes fixed on me. I was at my wits' end. Every attempt to get rid of her failed. I buried the doll deep in the backyard, only to find it waiting for me on the front porch the next morning. I even took it back to the attic and locked it in the chest. But somehow, each time, the doll would find its way back to me. It was then that I realized the truth. The doll wasn't haunting the house, it was haunting me. I sought the help of a psychic, a woman who claimed to be able to communicate with spirits. She came to the house and immediately went to the living room, where the doll had once again made its home. As soon as she saw it, her expression hardened. "This is not just a spirit," she said gravely. "This doll is bound by something much darker than a mere soul. It's a part of the woman who created it, a part of her grief and madness, and it's feeding on you." The psychic performed a ritual to cleanse the house, using incense and chanting words I couldn't understand. She asked me to leave the room while she worked, and I could feel the temperature drop as she did her work. But when I returned, the doll was gone. I thought it was over. But as the days went by, the house began to feel different. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and shadows seemed to lurk just out of sight. Then one night, as I sat in bed, I heard it again. The soft, giggling laughter. This time, I knew better than to search for her. I didn't need to. I could feel her presence, cold and heavy, in the room with me. And in the dead of night, I felt her small, cold hands brush against my skin. The doll had never really left. She was always there, waiting. And I knew then that no matter how hard I tried to escape, she would always find her way back to me. When I bought the old house on Hawthorne Street, I thought it was the perfect place to start fresh. The town was small, quiet, and seemed like the ideal escape from the busy city life. The house was an imposing Victorian with a lot of history, and while it had seen better days, there was something about it that drew me in. One day, while cleaning out the basement, I stumbled upon an old trunk, hidden beneath piles of forgotten furniture and boxes of knick-knacks. Curiosity piqued, I pried it open. Inside, I found a collection of things that seemed out of place: old clothes, yellowed newspapers, and at the very bottom, a doll. She was a porcelain doll with delicate features and a soft, sweet smile that seemed innocent at first. Her dress was made of lace and satin, a faded pink that had lost its vibrancy over the years. But what unsettled me were her eyes, deep, dark, and lifelike. They seemed to stare right through me as I lifted her from the trunk. I hadn't expected to find anything valuable, but there was something about the doll that captivated me. She felt oddly familiar, as though I had seen her before, though I knew I hadn't. Something about her presence made me feel uneasy, but I couldn't explain why. I decided to keep her, placing her on a shelf in my living room as a strange decoration. But from the moment I set her down, things started to happen. The first night, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. I assumed it was the house settling, but when I got up to check, no one was there. The footsteps came every night, and I'd often hear them as I lay in bed, heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't find the source. Then the noises began, soft, faint whispers, like children playing in another room. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of giggling, so close, yet so far away. The whispers were muffled, but they were unmistakable. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or my imagination, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. One evening, after a particularly unsettling night of whispers, I walked into the living room to find the doll had moved. She was no longer sitting upright on the shelf, but had fallen face down on the floor. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I picked her up and set her back in place. That night, I was woken by a loud crash. Rushing into the living room, I found the doll had fallen once again, but this time her head was turned completely to the side, as though she were looking directly at me. I couldn't take it any longer. I had to know what was happening. I researched the house's history, digging through old records and newspapers. It wasn't long before I came across an article about the original owner of the house, a woman named Margaret Wells. She had lived in the house with her daughter, Eleanor, but when Eleanor died tragically at a young age, Margaret had become obsessed with keeping her daughter's spirit alive. Margaret had been an accomplished doll maker, and after Eleanor's death, she created a series of dolls that she believed would carry her daughter's soul. The article claimed that one of the dolls had been known to move on its own, a phenomenon that had been dismissed as superstition. But after reading that, I began to question everything. Late one night, I heard the whispers again, but this time they were louder, clearer. They were coming from the basement. With my heart racing, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the creaky stairs. The air was cold, damp, and heavy. I moved slowly through the shadows until I reached the far corner of the basement. That's when I saw it. The doll. She was sitting in the middle of the floor, her porcelain face cracked, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. She wasn't in the trunk where I had left her. And there, standing beside her, was another figure. A young girl, no older than 10, with long dark hair and a white dress stained with what looked like dirt. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide with a hollow, lifeless gaze. "Help me," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. I froze. My body refused to move as the girl took a step closer, her feet making no sound against the floor. Before I could react, the doll's head twisted, its eyes locking with mine. The whispers became a chorus of voices, all pleading, begging for something I couldn't understand. Panic surged through me and I turned to run, but the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I pounded on the door, trying to escape, but the handle wouldn't budge. I could feel the doll's eyes on me, and the air in the basement grew thick, suffocating. With a burst of adrenaline, I finally managed to break free. I ran up the stairs and out of the house, never looking back. I left the house that night and I never went back. The doll and the girl were no longer my concern. But I still hear the whispers sometimes, especially when I am alone. And every so often, in the reflection of a darkened window or in the corner of my vision, I see her, standing in the shadows, waiting. I don't know what Margaret Wells did to that doll or what she trapped inside it, but I know one thing for sure. It's not over, and it never will be. It started on a rainy afternoon, a day just like any other. The weather had kept me indoors and I was tidying up the attic of the old house I had recently inherited. It wasn't the most welcoming place, dusty and dimly lit, but it was mine now and I needed to make it livable. As I sifted through boxes, I discovered something that immediately piqued my interest: a large wooden chest tucked away beneath old quilts and boxes of forgotten belongings. Curious, I pulled it from its hiding spot. It was heavy, with intricate carvings of roses and faces etched into the wood. After a bit of struggling, I managed to pry it open, revealing what appeared to be a collection of beautifully crafted porcelain dolls. Their faces were eerily lifelike, each one dressed in Victorian-era clothing. But one doll stood out from the rest. She was placed in the center of the chest, surrounded by the others, her eyes wide and filled with an unsettling intensity. Her hair was made of fine silk, and her dress shimmered with delicate lace. However, what caught my attention was the small brass tag attached to her wrist. The engraving on it read, "Made by Henrietta Vale, 1893. Henrietta Vale. The name was familiar. My grandmother, who had passed away years ago, often mentioned a renowned doll maker who had once lived in our town. I had never paid much attention to her stories, thinking they were just local legends, but seeing this doll, I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. I decided to keep the doll. She seemed to be the centerpiece of the collection, and I thought she might be worth something. I placed her on a shelf in my living room, thinking she would make a quirky conversation piece. But from the moment I set her down, I began to notice strange things happening in the house. At night, the air would grow inexplicably cold in the living room, where the doll sat. Sometimes I would wake up to the sound of faint whispers, barely audible, but enough to make my skin crawl. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination, but the feeling of being watched never left me. One evening, I noticed something even more unsettling. As I passed by the shelf, I could have sworn the doll's eyes followed me, tracking my movements. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was aware of my presence. The events escalated quickly. I began finding the doll in different positions each day. She would shift slightly, always facing a new direction, as if she were trying to get closer to me. I checked the shelf to make sure she hadn't been knocked over by a draft or an accident, but there was never any sign of disturbance. The whispers grew louder too. They started to come from the doll itself. It wasn't just faint murmurs anymore. They were clear, distinct voices pleading for help. One voice in particular stood out. It was soft, a woman's voice filled with despair and regret. It wasn't until I found the old newspaper article that I learned the full story behind Henrietta Vale. She wasn't just a doll maker, she was infamous for her obsession with creating the perfect doll. Rumor had it that she had once been a renowned sculptor who lost her ability to create real art after a tragic accident. She turned to doll making as a way to regain her former glory, but something went horribly wrong. The article detailed how Henrietta had gone mad in the last years of her life, her obsession growing into something dark. She was said to have used her own blood in the creation of her dolls, pouring her essence into them, hoping to somehow give them life. In the end, she was found dead in her home, surrounded by her dolls, but no one knew what had happened to them. As I read through the article, a wave of dread washed over me. I realized the doll I had found wasn't just a piece of history, it was part of Henrietta Vale's twisted obsession, and I had unknowingly brought it into my home. That night, the whispers grew louder, and this time they were accompanied by scratching sounds, as if someone or something was trying to escape. I rushed into the living room, and to my horror, the doll was no longer sitting on the shelf. Instead, she was standing on the floor, her porcelain feet now facing the door. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she were looking right at me, and her eyes, those hollow, lifelike eyes, seemed to be pleading for release. Terrified, I backed away slowly, unsure of what to do. The doll's presence felt oppressive, suffocating. Then, as if in response to my fear, the whispers intensified and a cold gust of wind blew through the room. The curtains fluttered violently, and I felt a heavy pressure in the air, like the room was closing in on me. The voices were no longer just whispers. They were words, clear and urgent. "Help me. Please, set me free." Without thinking, I grabbed the doll and ran to the attic. I had to get rid of her. She couldn't stay in my house any longer. I locked her in the trunk and pushed it to the farthest corner of the attic, hoping that would be enough to silence her. But as I returned to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The house felt wrong, as if the presence of the doll had infected every corner of it. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, listening for any sounds, any signs that the doll was still in the house. Hours passed in silence, but I could still hear her voice echoing in my mind, pleading, begging for release. The next morning, I woke up to find the doll back in my living room, sitting on the shelf exactly where I had first placed her. She hadn't been there before I went to bed, and I hadn't heard her move. Yet somehow she was there, as if mocking me. That was the last straw. I couldn't keep her. I had to rid myself of the curse that had followed me. But no matter how far I traveled, no matter how many times I tried to burn the doll or throw her away, she always found her way back to me. Now I am forced to live with her, always watching, always waiting. Henrietta Vale's doll never leaves me, and neither does her curse. I wasn't sure what had possessed me to buy that old house. It wasn't exactly in the best shape, and its history was riddled with dark rumors that had been whispered over the years. But something about it felt right. The moment I stepped inside, it was as if I had been pulled into a different world, one that seemed frozen in time. I had always loved old houses, their creaky floors, their drafty rooms, the sense of mystery that clung to them like dust. But this one, in particular, felt different. It felt alive, as though the house had a story to tell, if only I could listen closely enough. It didn't take long before I found the attic. The door had been hidden behind a stack of old furniture in the back corner of the house. When I finally pried it open, I was greeted by the smell of mildew and dust, the air thick with years of neglect. But what caught my attention wasn't the cobwebs or the forgotten furniture. It was the large wooden chest sitting in the center of the room, as if it had been waiting for me. With a mixture of curiosity and hesitation, I approached the chest. It was old, the wood darkened by age, and there was a strange symbol carved into the lid, some sort of intricate pattern, like an ancient rune. My heart raced as I slowly opened it, unsure of what I might find. Inside, nestled carefully between layers of old blankets, was a porcelain doll. She was beautiful, almost too beautiful, with delicate features and a haunting expression. Her face was perfectly painted, her eyes large and glassy, and her hair was made of fine silk. But there was something unsettling about her, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She looked too real, as if she was staring right into my soul. I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of unease as I reached for her. As my fingers brushed against the doll's smooth surface, I noticed something odd. The porcelain seemed colder than it should have been, as if it had been sitting in the attic for decades, untouched by time. I could feel a slight vibration in my hands, and I pulled away, feeling a shiver crawl down my spine. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had placed the doll on a shelf in my living room, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. I had tried to dismiss it as nothing more than my imagination, but the unease gnawed at me, growing stronger as the hours passed. Around midnight, I heard the faint sound of footsteps, soft, shuffling steps, coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then it happened again. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, but the footsteps grew louder and I could hear the creak of the floorboards above me. My heart began to race as I slowly made my way up to the attic. The door was ajar and a cold draft rushed past me as I stepped inside. The chest was still in the same spot, but the doll, she was gone. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. There was no way the doll could have moved on her own, but there was no other explanation. I scoured the attic, checking every corner, every hidden nook, but there was no sign of her. It wasn't until I returned to the living room that I saw it. The doll was sitting on the couch, staring at me with those same lifeless eyes. I froze, my blood running cold. I had been in the living room just minutes ago and she hadn't been there. I knew I had placed her on the shelf. How had she moved, and why? The house seemed to close in around me as I slowly walked toward her. I could feel her eyes on me, following me every step of the way. The air in the room grew colder, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, watching the doll from across the room, my eyes never leaving her. I was afraid that if I blinked, if I looked away for even a second, she would move again. But no matter how long I stared, she remained still. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it had just been a figment of my imagination. Perhaps I had been too tired, too stressed, and my mind had played tricks on me. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences became more frequent. The doll would appear in different places around the house, always watching, always waiting. I would find her sitting on the windowsill, staring out into the night, or standing in the hallway, as if she were trying to follow me. One evening, after returning home from work, I found the doll sitting on the kitchen table, but this time something was different. Her expression had changed. Her lips were slightly curved into a smile, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a sinister, knowing smile. My stomach turned as I stared at her, unable to tear my eyes away. I felt as though I were losing control. The house had become a prison, and the doll was its warden. No matter how hard I tried to escape, I couldn't escape her gaze. It was as if she had taken root in my mind, a constant presence that I couldn't rid myself of. I began to research the history of the house, hoping to find some explanation for the strange happenings. The more I dug, the more I uncovered. The doll had belonged to the previous owner of the house, a woman named Eleanor Finch. She had been a reclusive artist known for her life-sized porcelain creations. But as her career progressed, her mental state deteriorated. She became obsessed with creating the perfect doll, and it was rumored that she had used strange rituals in her work, trying to bring her creations to life. Eleanor Finch had died under mysterious circumstances, her body found in the attic, surrounded by her dolls. Some said she had gone mad in her later years, consumed by her obsession. Others claimed that her dolls had driven her to the brink of insanity. I could feel the walls closing in as the realization hit me. The doll wasn't just a doll, it was a vessel for something far darker than I had ever imagined. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. But no matter where I went, no matter how far I traveled, I knew the doll would follow me. She always did. The doll in the attic had become my curse, a nightmare that I could never escape. And now, wherever I go, I can feel her presence, always watching, always waiting. She is with me, always. My grandmother had always warned me about certain things, never to open a specific drawer in her house, never to go into the cellar after dark, and never to touch the dolls that lined the shelves in the attic. I always thought it was just a way to scare me, a collection of strange old family traditions. But there was one doll that stood out, a porcelain figure dressed in a tattered lace gown, with a face that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, just enough to make you wonder if it was watching you. I had spent most of my childhood summers at her house, playing outside, listening to her stories, and exploring every corner of the place. But I never dared to go into the attic. The stories my grandmother told me about that attic always gave me a sense of foreboding. She said it was a place where things came to life at night, where the air was thick with whispers of the past. She never elaborated further, but I knew enough to avoid it. It was the summer after my grandmother passed away when the temptation became too great. I had returned to her house, now empty, to go through her things, sorting out what to keep and what to sell. It felt like a duty, but more than that, I felt a strange pull to finally face the one thing I had been avoiding my entire life, the attic. I couldn't ignore the thought of it any longer, and despite the unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach, I knew it was time. I climbed up the narrow stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The door to the attic was exactly how I remembered it, old and weathered, with a brass handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. When I turned the knob, the door creaked open with a groan, and the musty smell of aged wood and forgotten memories hit me. It was dim, the only light coming from a small window that let in just enough to make everything seem a little more mysterious. The attic was filled with old furniture, boxes of photos and books, and countless trinkets. But it was the dolls that caught my attention. They were lined up along the shelves, some of them still in perfect condition, others cracked and faded with age. And there she was, the one my grandmother had warned me about, the porcelain doll, sitting in the center of the room, as if waiting for me. Her face was smooth, but her eyes seemed too real, too expressive, as though they were following me. I tried to shake off the growing unease. It was just a doll after all. But as I took a step closer, I noticed something strange. The room seemed colder, the air heavier. I reached out to touch the doll, my fingers brushing against her cold, smooth face. The instant I did, the temperature in the room dropped. My breath became visible, swirling in the air like fog. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a shiver ran down my spine. Suddenly a sharp noise broke the silence, the sound of something heavy falling from one of the shelves. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the dolls sitting perfectly still. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was overtired from the emotional strain of the past few days. But as I turned back to the porcelain doll, I felt a chill that wasn't just from the temperature. It was as if she had moved, ever so slightly. Her head was turned, just enough to suggest she had been watching me the entire time. That night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I could hear strange sounds coming from the attic, soft creaks like the sound of someone moving around. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was the house settling, but the sounds grew louder, closer. I could swear I heard whispers, low, muffled voices that seemed to call my name. My heart raced, and I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me, thick with something I couldn't explain. The next morning, I was determined to leave the attic behind. I packed my things and decided it was time to go through the rest of the house, but when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped in my tracks. The attic door was wide open. I had clearly shut it the night before. I hesitated, my mind racing. Maybe I had forgotten to lock it. Maybe the house was just playing tricks on me. But as I stood there, staring at the open door, I realized something else. The doll, the porcelain doll, wasn't in the attic anymore. I rushed upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The attic was empty, save for the remaining dolls on the shelves, but she was gone. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air. Panic seized me, and I searched every corner of the room, but there was no sign of her. That evening, as I was sitting in the living room, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my chest, I saw it. The doll was sitting on the coffee table, staring at me with those haunting eyes. My breath caught in my throat, and my hands trembled as I reached for her. I had no idea how she had gotten there, but something in me knew I couldn't leave her in the house. I grabbed the doll and rushed out the door, heading straight for the woods behind the house. I didn't know what compelled me to do it, but I had to get rid of her. I dug a small hole, placing the doll in it and covering it with dirt, hoping to bury the nightmare once and for all. But as I turned to leave, I heard a voice. It wasn't a whisper this time, but a clear, distinct voice. It sounded like my grandmother's, faint but unmistakable. "Don't bury her!" I froze, my heart racing in my chest. My grandmother had always warned me about the doll, but now I understood. She had never wanted me to touch it because the doll was cursed, trapped with something that could never be freed. And now it was too late. I looked back at the spot where I had buried the doll, but when I did, I saw something horrifying. The ground had been disturbed, the dirt scattered and overturned. The doll wasn't there anymore. It had followed me, just like it always did. I had never been particularly afraid of dolls. Sure, some of them were a bit unsettling with their glassy eyes and stiff, lifeless smiles, but it never bothered me much. However, all of that changed the moment I inherited my great-aunt Clara's collection. She had passed away unexpectedly, and I found myself inheriting the old family home along with everything inside it, including her extensive collection of antique dolls. My great-aunt had always been somewhat of an enigma. She was quiet, often reclusive, and when she did speak of her dolls, it was always with a certain reverence, as if they were more than just toys. She spoke of them like they were old friends, companions that had been with her through the most challenging moments of her life. There was one doll in particular she had always spoken of in hushed tones, a small porcelain figure that sat on a velvet cushion in the corner of her living room. It was delicate, with dark brown curls, a lace dress, and eyes that seemed too lifelike for something made of porcelain. I didn't know what to make of it, but I didn't think much of it when I moved into her home after the funeral. The house was old, dusty, and full of memories I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. But as I began sorting through her belongings, something strange started happening. At night, I would hear faint footsteps echoing down the halls, light tapping sounds like someone was walking, yet there was no one there. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and find objects had been moved, books, trinkets, and even the dolls themselves. One evening, while dusting off the shelves in the living room, I decided to take a closer look at the porcelain doll. As I picked it up, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was heavier than I expected, almost unnaturally so. I inspected it closely, noticing that its glassy eyes seemed to shimmer as though they were staring at me. I shuddered and put the doll back down, but it felt as though it had never left my thoughts. The occurrences grew more frequent over the next few days. I would hear soft whispers coming from the corners of rooms when no one was there, and strange drafts would brush past me even when the windows were tightly closed. My dreams, too, grew unsettling. I would find myself in my great-aunt's living room, staring at the doll, its eyes following my every movement. But what terrified me most was the smile that had begun to form on the doll's face. Each night, when I returned to the living room, it seemed a little more pronounced, a little more menacing. Then one evening, as I was sitting alone in the living room reading a book, I heard a soft, creaking sound coming from the direction of the attic. The house was old, and it was no stranger to strange sounds, but this creak was different. It was deliberate, almost as if someone was walking around up there. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My curiosity got the better of me, and I climbed up to the attic, determined to find the source of the noise. The moment I opened the attic door, a rush of cold air hit me, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. The attic was full of old boxes, bags of clothes, and various forgotten relics. But in the far corner was something that caught my eye, a small, dusty chest. I hesitated, but then walked over to it. It was an old wooden chest, beautifully carved with intricate designs that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. I slowly lifted the lid and found an assortment of items inside, but what caught my attention was a bundle of old letters tied with a red ribbon. I untied the ribbon and began reading. The letters were written by my great aunt, but they were dated back to her childhood. In them, she spoke of a strange and unsettling event, a doll that her grandmother had given her. The doll, the very one I had been so drawn to, had been passed down through generations. But what struck me as odd was how my great aunt described the doll's behavior. She spoke of how it would sometimes move on its own, its eyes changing color, and how, in her youth, she had often heard faint whispers from it in the dead of night. According to the letters, the doll had been cursed. My great-aunt's grandmother had warned her that the doll contained a spirit, a restless entity that had once been trapped within it. The doll, she said, would serve as a vessel for the spirit, feeding off the energy of those who cared for it. Over time, it would begin to demand more and more, eventually taking control of its owner. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I had thought it was all just superstition, a silly family myth. But as I read on, I felt a growing sense of dread. My great-aunt had written that the doll was never meant to be left alone, that it should never be abandoned. She spoke of how, over the years, the doll had started to change, becoming more sinister, more demanding. She had even mentioned that the only way to rid oneself of the doll was to pass it on, to give it to someone else who would become its next victim. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I realized the gravity of what I had done. I had taken the doll, brought it into my home, and unleashed the curse. I quickly left the attic, but as I descended the stairs, I froze in horror. The doll was gone. I rushed back to the living room, but it wasn't there. I searched the house, frantic, but there was no sign of it. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from every direction. I felt the coldness creep back into the house, and then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of porcelain scraping against wood. I turned to find the doll sitting on the floor, facing me with its unnerving smile, its eyes gleaming brighter than before. I knew then that I could never escape. I had always been fascinated by antiques. There was something about the idea that an object could carry the weight of history, a story of its own, that intrigued me. So when I heard about the mysterious doll maker who lived on the outskirts of town, I couldn't resist investigating. The locals rarely spoke of him, but whispers were enough to pique my curiosity. They said he was a genius at his craft, creating dolls so lifelike they were said to hold a strange power. No one knew much about his past, except that his creations had an unsettling air about them. As a lover of the macabre, I was eager to see for myself. I made my way to the small shop, nestled in a forgotten corner of the town. The building itself was old, with peeling paint and windows that seemed to have not seen daylight in years. I pushed open the creaky door, and a bell rang, alerting the shopkeeper to my presence. The man behind the counter was unlike anyone I had ever seen. Tall and gaunt, with sharp, almost unnatural features, he looked like someone who belonged in another time. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they watched me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Looking for something special?" he asked, his voice soft yet unsettling. "I've heard about your dolls," I replied, my curiosity getting the better of me. I wanted to see them for myself. The doll maker's lips curled into a strange smile, as though my words had pleased him. Without a word, he led me to the back of the shop, where shelves upon shelves of dolls stood. They were unlike anything I had ever seen, some with delicate porcelain faces, others with glassy eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I went. But what struck me the most was the atmosphere. There was a sense of stillness in the air, like the dolls were waiting for something. "Each one is unique," the doll maker said, as he picked up a doll and placed it in my hands. "Made with the finest materials, crafted with care. But be careful," he added, his tone darkening. "Some dolls have a history." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had seen enough horror movies to know where this was going, but I wasn't about to leave just yet. The doll in my hands felt oddly warm, like it had been held recently. Its glassy eyes seemed to stare into my soul. "This one is different," the doll maker whispered, his eyes narrowing as he watched me. "It's one of my oldest creations. A doll meant to bring peace, or so I thought. But sometimes the things we create have a mind of their own." I laughed nervously, dismissing his words as the ramblings of an eccentric artist. "I'm sure it's just a doll." But the doll maker's expression didn't change. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out an old, weathered book. It was bound in leather, its pages yellowed with age. He opened it to a page that was filled with strange symbols and handwritten notes. "This is the curse," he said, "the curse that comes with the dolls. You see, every doll I've made has been imbued with a part of my soul, a piece of my essence. It's how I've been able to create them, so lifelike. But the price is steep. With each doll I make, a part of me becomes tied to it. And if someone takes one without knowing its true nature, well..." The doll maker paused, his eyes fixed on the doll I was still holding. "The curse begins." Suddenly, the room grew colder, and I felt an icy chill creep up my spine. I looked down at the doll, only to see that its eyes had shifted. Not dramatically, but just enough that it seemed to be staring at me with a new, more intense gaze. I quickly set it back on the counter, unnerved by the shift in the atmosphere. "I think I've seen enough." But the doll maker wasn't finished. He closed the book with a decisive thud and placed it back under the counter. "You don't understand, do you? You've already taken it." I froze. "What do you mean?" "The curse isn't something you can just walk away from," he said, his voice low and ominous. "Once it's been touched, once it's been taken, you belong to it. You belong to the doll." Panic surged through me. I wanted to leave, to run, but something about his words kept me rooted to the spot. A feeling of dread settled over me as I turned to leave the shop. But as I stepped outside, I realized something that made my heart race. The doll was in my bag. I hadn't put it there. I hadn't even touched it since I placed it back on the counter. But But there it was, nestled inside the bag, its eyes glaring back at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The doll seemed to be everywhere, its cold eyes staring at me from the corner of the room, on the edge of my bed, even under the covers. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint whispers, like a voice calling out to me, urging me to look at it. When I finally did, I saw its mouth move. It whispered my name. The whispers became louder and louder each night until I could no longer escape them. The doll had become a part of my life, and with each passing day, the curse tightened its grip on me. I began to hear footsteps in the halls, feel a cold presence in the room with me, and see strange shadows lurking just beyond my vision. I tried to get rid of the doll, burning it, burying it, even throwing it into the ocean. But every time it returned, always in the same place, waiting for me to take it back. The doll maker had warned me, but I didn't listen. And now the doll was with me, always. I don't know how much longer I have before the curse consumes me completely. But one thing is certain. The doll will never leave, and neither will I. I was always skeptical of anything supernatural, but there was something about that doll that unsettled me. I had bought it on a whim at an antique shop on a quiet street in the heart of the city. The shop itself was filled with old curiosities, everything from old clocks to tarnished silverware. The moment I laid eyes on the doll, it was as if it called to me, urging me to take it home. The doll was like no other I had ever seen. Its porcelain skin was smooth with delicate hands and feet, and its face was painted with a serene expression that didn't seem to fit the age of the doll. Its eyes, dark and glassy, seemed to shimmer under the dim lighting of the shop. The moment I touched it, a chill ran through my body, but I shrugged it off as nothing more than the cold air in the shop. I bought the doll, thinking it would be an interesting addition to my collection of antiques. As I walked home that day, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of attachment to it. It wasn't until I got home and placed the doll on the shelf in my living room that I noticed something odd. Its eyes seemed to be staring at me, no matter where I stood. At first, I brushed it off as a trick of the light. But as days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was watching me, following me with its gaze wherever I went. I found it hard to focus on anything else when I was in the room. Its presence was overwhelming, like an invisible hand gripping my thoughts. The strange occurrences started slowly, almost imperceptibly. At night, I would hear faint whispers, so faint that I thought I was imagining them. The whispers seemed to come from the direction of the doll, but whenever I would glance over, it was always in the same position, staring blankly ahead. I decided to ignore it, telling myself I was simply exhausted and that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the whispers didn't stop. One night, as I was preparing for bed, I walked past the shelf where the doll sat. This time, its gaze was no longer fixed ahead. Its eyes were trained on me, following my every move. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a step back, staring at the doll. It seemed to be watching me, waiting for something. Then I heard it, a voice, clear as day, coming from the doll. "Take me with you." I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just heard. It wasn't possible. Dolls didn't speak, but the voice had been so real, so insistent that I couldn't deny it. I stood there in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. The next day, I decided to leave the house for a while. Maybe getting out would clear my head, I thought. But as I left the apartment and walked out into the street, I felt a strange unease settle in the pit of my stomach. I glanced over my shoulder as if expecting to see something following me. But nothing was there. Later that night when I returned, I found the doll in the center of the living room floor. It had been on the shelf when I left. I hadn't touched it. There was no way it could have moved on its own. Terrified, I tried to get rid of the doll. I threw it in the trash, locked the door, and tried to go to sleep. But when I woke up the next morning, it was back, sitting on the shelf, its glassy eyes fixed on me. This went on for weeks. I would try to throw it away, bury it, even burn it, but it always came back. Each time it would be a little closer, a little more insistent. The whispers became louder, more urgent. One night, desperate to end the torment, I locked the doll in the attic, far away from my sight. I thought that would be the end of it. But when I came home the next day, I found the doll back in the living room, sitting on the couch, as if it had never been moved. It wasn't just that the doll wouldn't leave. It seemed to be growing stronger, feeding off my fear. I could feel its presence even when I wasn't in the room, like an invisible force waiting for me to acknowledge it. The whispers became commands. "Play with me," it would say, in a voice that was both sweet and sinister. "I'm lonely. Take me with you." The requests grew more demanding, more persistent. One evening, in a panic, I tried to leave the house. I had enough of the doll and its terrifying grip on my life. As I grabbed my coat and made my way to the door, I heard it again, the voice calling to me. "I'm not letting you go," it whispered. Frozen in place, I turned around to face the doll. It was sitting on the arm of the couch, staring at me, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. It was at that moment that I realized something horrifying. The doll wasn't just a cursed object, it was trying to possess me. It wanted me, body and soul, to be its companion forever. And the more I resisted, the more it clung to me. I couldn't escape. I couldn't get away. No matter where I went, the doll would find its way back to me. The whispers never stopped. The eyes never stopped watching. And as the days wore on, I began to feel the pull, a dark, insidious force drawing me back to it. I was losing my mind. No one else could understand. No one could hear the whispers, see the doll move when I wasn't looking. They thought I was crazy, but I knew the truth. The doll had made its home inside my mind, inside my soul. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was a part of me, and I was a part of it. There was no escape. The doll would never let me go, and I knew deep down that I was doomed to be its prisoner forever, be it I had never been particularly interested in dolls. As a child, I preferred books and action figures to the delicate porcelain creations my grandmother adored. However, when my grandmother passed away, I inherited the small, dusty box she had kept in the attic. Inside it was an old doll, one I had never seen before. It wasn't like the others that decorated the shelves in her home. This one was different. The doll had pale, almost ghostly skin. Its black hair was tightly curled, and its wide, unblinking eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stared at it, but I shook off the feeling, reminding myself it was just a doll. I placed it on the mantel, a simple enough gesture, and thought little more of it. However, the presence of the doll began to weigh on me. It wasn't long before I started to feel like something was wrong. Every time I walked past it, I had the odd sense that it was staring directly at me. No matter where I stood, those cold, glassy eyes seemed to fixate on me, unblinking and unyielding. At night, I would hear strange sounds from the living room, faint creaks and rustles, like someone was moving around in the dark. I would tell myself it was the wind or the house settling, but the sounds persisted. I even went so far as to check the living room several times before going to bed, but nothing was ever out of place. One evening, after coming home from work, I found the doll had moved. It wasn't on the mantel anymore. Instead, it was sitting on the chair by the window, its hands neatly folded in its lap, as if waiting for me. I blinked in disbelief. I had clearly placed it on the mantel that morning. There was no way it could have moved by itself. I thought maybe I had subconsciously moved it during the day and forgotten about it, so I put the doll back on the mantel and tried to push the thought from my mind. But things only got worse. The whispers started a few nights later. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound at first, like a faint breeze rustling through the curtains. But as the days went by, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were words now, low, indecipherable murmurs that seemed to come from the direction of the doll. I would lie awake in bed, heart racing, as I listened to the sounds grow louder, the voice clearer. It wasn't until I finally mustered the courage to stand up and walk toward the living room that I realized the voice was speaking to me. "Come closer," it whispered. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. Slowly, with trembling hands, I reached for the door, creaking open the living room. And what I saw stopped me in my tracks. The doll wasn't sitting on the mantel anymore. It was on the floor in front of the fireplace, facing me, its head tilted slightly to one side. Its mouth was moving. The whispers came again, this time clearer. "You can't leave me, not now." I stumbled backward in shock, my breath catching in my throat. There was no way this was real. There was no way the doll could be moving, could be talking to me. But as I stood there, rooted in terror, I knew I had no other choice but to confront it. I took a step forward, hesitant, but the moment I did, the doll's head snapped in my direction. Its eyes locked onto mine, and a wave of cold fear washed over me. The voice was louder now, sharper, like nails scraping against a chalkboard. "You can't escape me." I rushed to grab the doll, half out of anger and half out of fear, but the moment I touched it, I felt a jolt of ice, cold energy run through my hand. It burned like I was touching something that wasn't supposed to be. The doll's eyes seemed to glint with a strange, malicious glee, and I dropped it in horror. In the days that followed, I began to notice something more disturbing. Strange things began happening around the house. Objects would move on their own, doors would creak open in the dead of night, and sometimes I would wake to find the doll in a different spot, staring at me with its unblinking gaze. But that was just the beginning. One evening, as I prepared to go to bed, I noticed that the doll was no longer in the living room. I searched the house, checking every corner, every room, but it was nowhere to be found. Panic began to set in. I didn't want to admit it, but I was terrified. I could feel the doll's presence, its cold, lifeless energy, watching me, waiting. Suddenly I heard it again, the whisper. "Come find me." The voice was clear now, sharp and commanding. It was no longer a whisper, it was an invitation, a challenge. The house felt wrong. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister, and the walls felt like they were closing in on me. I walked through the house, following the voice, my hands trembling, my mind racing. It led me to the attic. I had never been up there. It was a small, dusty space, full of forgotten boxes and old furniture, but something felt different tonight. As I stepped inside, the air grew heavier, colder, and I could see out of the corner of my eye a faint movement. The doll. There it was, sitting in the center of the attic, its porcelain skin cracked and chipped, its hair wild and disheveled. Its eyes glinted with an almost triumphant look, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. I reached out to grab it, but the moment my fingers touched the doll, everything went black. I woke up hours later in the attic, surrounded by an overwhelming darkness. The doll was gone. I stumbled down the stairs, frantic, only to find that it had returned to its spot on the mantel, just as it had always been. But this time it was different. The eyes were no longer empty. They glowed faintly, like they were alive. And they were no longer watching me, they were inside my mind, whispering their demands, their commands. They were calling me, pulling me toward them, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I was no longer the one in control. The doll had taken over, and it wouldn't let go. I realized then that I was never meant to escape. It wasn't just a doll anymore, it was a force, an entity, and now it had me, and it wasn't going to stop until I was nothing more than a part of it. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare into its eyes. When I was a child, I lived in a quiet, small town that was tucked away in the hills. The town had a history that most of the residents liked to forget. It was always a bit eerie, especially when night fell. The whispers about the old doll-maker's shop were the most unsettling stories I'd heard. They spoke of strange dolls, cursed and alive, and the eerie figure of the doll-maker himself. I didn't believe it at first. As a child, I was more interested in the stories about the spooky old mansion on the edge of town, where my friends dared each other to go at night. But when my grandmother passed away, I was given something that would change everything: a doll. It wasn't just any doll, it was an intricately crafted porcelain doll, its face delicate and painted with lifelike features. It had glass eyes that seemed too realistic, too knowing. Its hair was dark and soft, and its little hands were meticulously sculpted, holding on to a tiny bouquet of flowers. My grandmother had told me that it was a gift from the doll maker, a man who had long since disappeared from the town. She'd received it when she was a young girl and had kept it in a special box ever since. She told me that the doll was valuable, not just for its craftsmanship, but for the story behind it. It was the last doll he ever made, she said, with a faraway look in her eyes. He made it for a very special reason. I didn't understand at the time. I just thought it was an odd thing for her to say. But the moment she gave me the doll, I felt an unsettling connection to it. I didn't know why, but it felt like it had been waiting for me. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. The doll, which I had placed on a shelf in my room, would appear in different spots when I wasn't looking. First, it was at the foot of my bed, then it was on the windowsill. Each time I found it, it would be sitting there, perfectly still, as if it had never been moved at all. I started to feel like I was being watched, but not by anything I could see. The sensation crept over me at night, when the house was quiet and I was lying in bed. I could almost hear the soft rustle of the doll's clothing, the subtle creak of porcelain against wood. It was enough to make my skin crawl. One night I woke up to the sound of footsteps in my room. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting shadows on the walls. And there it was, the doll, standing in the middle of my room, its glass eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I thought I was dreaming. But when I reached for it, My hand froze. The doll's eyes were staring directly at me, unblinking, its tiny porcelain face impossibly alive. A whisper echoed through my mind, low, sweet, and dangerous. "Come to me." I screamed and backed away, but the doll didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I bolted out of bed and ran to my parents' room, but when I returned the next morning, the doll was gone from its usual spot. It took weeks before I found it again, hidden at the bottom of my closet, its delicate fingers curled in a silent plea. It had somehow moved on its own again. The fear I felt was overwhelming. I knew something was terribly wrong. I started to ask around about the doll maker. The more I learned, the more the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The man had been known for his skill, but also for his strange behavior. There were rumors that he had dabbled in the occult, using his dolls to house spirits and souls. The last doll he ever made was said to have been created with dark magic, a doll that was supposed to trap the soul of the person who owned it. The town had tried to burn his shop down years ago, after it was discovered that many of the dolls he had made were rumored to be cursed, but the fire had failed to destroy the shop, and the doll maker had vanished without a trace. The more I learned, the more I began to understand what was happening. The doll in my possession wasn't just a doll, it was a vessel for something far darker. It was the last doll he had made, and it wasn't meant for me. It had been waiting for me, and now it had me in its grip. One night, desperate and terrified, I decided to confront the doll. I placed it in the middle of my room and stood over it, shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The doll's eyes glinted in the moonlight, and for a moment everything was still. Then, as if answering me, the doll slowly tilted its head, its porcelain face cracking. The voice I heard was not my own, but something ancient and unsettling. "Your soul." The doll's body began to twist and contort in unnatural ways. I watched in horror as its arms and legs stretched and bent in impossible angles, its porcelain skin cracking and peeling away, revealing something underneath, something dark and writhing. I screamed and ran out of the room, but the door slammed shut behind me. I could feel the presence of the doll everywhere, pressing in on me. It was chasing me, following me, its voice whispering in my ears. I didn't stop running until I reached the town cemetery, the place where the doll maker was buried. I knew I had to end this, to destroy the doll before it claimed me completely. I dug through the dirt, heart racing, and found the doll maker's grave. With trembling hands, I placed the cursed doll on the stone and whispered a prayer, begging for forgiveness, for a way to break the curse. The ground beneath me trembled, and for a moment everything fell silent. Then, with a loud crash, the doll crumbled into dust, its curse broken at last. But the whispers still haunt me. I can still hear them in the back of my mind, calling me, pulling me towards something I can't escape. The dollmaker's curse may have been broken, but I know it's never truly gone. I will never be free of it. And somewhere, in the dark corners of my mind, I can still hear the doll's faint whisper, telling me that it will find me again. I never liked dolls. There was something unsettling about them. Their lifeless eyes, the way they stared at you no matter where you were in the room. But when I inherited my grandmother's house after she passed away, I found myself face to face with something that changed my view forever. The house was old, with creaky floors and an aroma of nostalgia that seemed to seep through the walls. It had been abandoned for years, left to collect dust and memories. My grandmother had always been a bit of a hoarder, so when I began sorting through her things, I wasn't surprised to find boxes filled with old trinkets, clothing, and forgotten possessions. But one thing stood out to me, something I hadn't seen before, a small wooden chest hidden beneath a pile of forgotten books. The chest was intricately carved, with strange symbols etched into the sides. It was heavy, as if holding something of great value, or something far more sinister. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a doll. Inside, a porcelain doll dressed in an antique lace gown with golden curls and piercing blue eyes that seemed to follow me as I moved. The doll was beautiful, but there was something off about it. The eyes too perfect and too real. The tiny, delicate hands that looked as if they could move at any moment. I didn't know why, but the sight of it filled me with dread. I tried to ignore it. I packed it away and left it in the corner of my attic. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Every time I passed the attic, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, as if something was calling me, beckoning me to come closer. A few days later, I was woken in the middle of the night by a soft sound, almost like a whisper. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the attic. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe a mouse or some other animal had gotten inside. But the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they grew more insistent, more desperate. I couldn't ignore them any longer. I hesitated for a moment, then climbed up the stairs to the attic. The air was cold and musty, and the darkness seemed to stretch out forever. As I approached the corner where I had left the chest, I froze. The doll was gone. Panic surged through me. I looked around frantically, but the attic was silent, save for the faint sound of my own breathing. I checked every corner, every box, but there was no sign of the doll. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. That night I barely slept, tossing and turning in my bed. I kept hearing that same whispering sound, only now it seemed to be in my room. It was as though the doll was calling to me, coming closer, getting louder with every passing hour. I was starting to lose my grip on reality. I couldn't escape it. The next morning, I went back to the attic to search again, determined to find the doll and get rid of it once and for all. But what I found was worse than I could have imagined. The doll was sitting on the chest, staring at me with those lifeless eyes. It had returned. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know how it had gotten there, but I knew I had to get rid of it. I grabbed the doll by its porcelain arm and tossed it into the fireplace, watching as the flames licked at its delicate features. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, something strange happened. The flames seemed to flicker and twist unnaturally, as if the doll were alive, struggling against the fire. The room grew colder, and the whispers became louder, more frantic. Suddenly the flames died, leaving nothing but ashes behind. But when I looked at the hearth, I saw it. What remained of the doll was not ashes, but a small, charred piece of porcelain, still intact. The eyes, those haunting eyes. I ran from the house, my mind reeling with terror. What was happening? How could the doll survive the fire? I had to leave, to escape. But even as I slammed the door behind me, I knew it was not over. The doll had followed me. In the weeks that followed, the doll's presence grew stronger. It began to appear in strange places, in my kitchen, on my bed, in the mirror when I wasn't looking. It was as if it was taunting me, tormenting me with its unblinking stare. I began to lose track of time, my life unraveling, as the doll's hold over me tightened. The whispers grew louder, louder, until I could hear them even when I was awake, even when I was surrounded by people. I couldn't escape. I couldn't sleep. The doll was always there, watching me, waiting for something I couldn't understand. It wasn't until I found the old journal buried in the attic that I realized the truth. The doll maker, the creator of that cursed doll, had been a man driven mad by his obsession with immortality. He believed that by trapping a soul inside his creations he could live forever. But in the end, he was consumed by his own creations. His dolls came to life, each one more powerful and malevolent than the last. And it was this particular doll, the one my grandmother had kept, and now I had inherited, that held the most power. It had been waiting for someone, anyone, to take it, to awaken it from its slumber. And now it had me. I had no choice. The only way to stop the curse was to return the doll to its maker. I had to find the doll maker's grave, where he had been buried long ago, and bury the doll with him so that his evil would finally be put to rest. But when I reached the graveyard, the doll was already there. It sat atop the grave, its porcelain face cracked and charred, its glass eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It was waiting for me, waiting to complete its curse. I could feel the cold hands of the doll maker's curse around my throat as I tried to turn and run, but it was too late. The doll had already won. And as I watched my own reflection in the glassy eyes of the doll, I realized with chilling clarity that it was no longer me who was in control. It was the doll. And now it would never let me go. It was a rainy Tuesday when I inherited the old house on the outskirts of town. My great-aunt Eleanor, a woman I barely remembered, had passed away at the age of 97. She'd lived alone in a decaying mansion for most of her life, and my family had all but forgotten about her. When the will was read, I was the only one left in the family willing to take the house off their hands. The house was more of a mansion, really, a crumbling relic of the past, surrounded by overgrown trees and tangled vines. When I first stepped inside, the smell of mildew and dust hit me. It was eerily quiet, as if the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to come and claim it. The first few days in the house were uneventful. I spent my time cleaning, sorting through the old furniture, and trying to make the place livable. But it didn't take long for strange things to start happening. Small things at first. I'd hear footsteps behind me, even when I was alone. The lights would flicker and cold drafts would sweep through rooms with no open windows. But it wasn't until I found the attic that I realized this house was hiding something far darker than I could have imagined. The attic was a narrow, cluttered space filled with old trunks, dusty furniture, and boxes of forgotten belongings. It was the kind of place where things were put away and left to rot, never to see the light of day again. But something about it drew me in. Perhaps it was the strange sense of nostalgia that seemed to cling to the room. Or maybe it was the creaking floorboards, which made everything feel like it was alive, watching me. One day, while rummaging through a box in the corner, I found it. A doll. It was tucked inside a tattered blanket, as if it had been carefully hidden away for years. At first glance, it appeared to be a harmless, if slightly eerie, vintage doll. It had a porcelain face, dark, glassy eyes, and a beautiful red dress that had clearly seen better days. But when I touched it, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but there was something unsettling about the doll. Maybe it was the way its eyes seemed to follow me, or the feeling that I wasn't alone in that attic. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just an old, lifeless object. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. That night, I placed the doll on the shelf in the living room, thinking it would make a good decoration. But when I woke up the next morning, it was gone. At first, I assumed I had misplaced it, but when I checked every room in the house, I couldn't find it anywhere. As the days passed, the doll began to reappear in strange places. I would find it sitting on the stairs, staring at me from the top of the hallway, or even on the kitchen counter, its glassy eyes fixed on me as I made breakfast. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. It was as if the doll was moving on its own, taunting me. I tried to tell myself that I was just imagining things, that the doll couldn't possibly be moving around the house on its own. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was something deeply wrong with that doll. Something I couldn't explain. One night I decided to confront it. I locked all the doors and windows and sat in the living room waiting for the doll to appear.
Hours passed and nothing happened. Just as I was about to give up, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. There, standing in the doorway, was the doll, but it wasn't the same as before. Its porcelain face had been cracked, and its eyes, those cold, glassy eyes, had darkened, almost as if they were filled with something more sinister. I could feel my stomach twist with fear as the doll seemed to sway, as if moving toward me.
Before I could react, the doll's eyes seemed to flash, and suddenly I was no longer alone. Shadows began to fill the room, swirling around me, closing in. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. The darkness seemed to suffocate me, pressing in from all sides. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The shadows retreated and the room returned to normal, but the doll was gone. I ran to the attic, desperate to find the source of whatever was haunting me. When I arrived, I was met with the worst sight imaginable. The doll was sitting on the floor, its face now cracked beyond recognition. Its eyes, once glassy and cold, were now completely black, empty voids that seemed to stare right through me. I knew then that the doll wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. I tried to burn it, to destroy it, but every time I attempted to set it on fire, the flames would go out, as if something were preventing it. I tried burying it in the yard, but the next morning it was back, sitting in the exact same spot where I had left it. Days turned into weeks, and my sanity began to unravel. The doll kept appearing in places I couldn't explain. It would show up beside my bed at night, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I heard its footsteps in the hallways, its whispers in the shadows. But it wasn't just the doll that haunted me. The house itself seemed to be changing. The walls would shift, creak, and groan, as if they were alive. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker. It felt like the house was closing in on me, trapping me in its twisted embrace. I couldn't stay any longer. I packed what little I could carry and left the house behind. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was still watching me, waiting for the moment when I would return. And now, years later, every time I look in the mirror, I see it. The doll's eyes watching me, waiting. I don't know if it's truly gone or if I'm still trapped in its curse. All I know is that it never stops watching. It never stops following me. And I fear that one day I'll return to the house, only to find the doll waiting for me in the dark, its smile twisted and evil, its eyes empty, and its vengeance never ending. It was my first visit to the small town of Eastwood, a sleepy place that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The buildings were old, the streets narrow, and the people distant, like they had secrets they weren't willing to share. I had come to Eastwood on a whim, tired of the hectic city life and hoping to escape the pressures of my job for a while. Little did I know, my visit would soon turn into a nightmare. The locals were friendly enough when I first arrived, but there was always a strange look in their eyes, as if they were silently judging me or holding back some truth. I didn't pay much attention to it until I stumbled upon a small shop tucked away in the corner of the town square. The sign above the door read, "Grayson's Dolls," in faded, hand-painted letters. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to step inside. The air inside the shop was thick with dust and the scent of old wood. The shelves were lined with hundreds of dolls, each one more intricate and lifelike than the last. There were porcelain dolls with delicate features, wooden ones with painted faces, and even a few rag dolls that looked like they had been sewn together by hand. It was an odd collection, but there was something strangely captivating about them. As I wandered through the aisles, my eyes were drawn to one particular doll in the far corner of the shop. It was unlike any of the others. The doll's face was unnervingly real, with dark, glassy eyes that seemed to follow me no matter where I moved. Its hair was long and black, falling in soft waves around its porcelain face. The doll was dressed in an old-fashioned lace dress, and its hands were posed in an almost lifelike manner, as if it were about to reach out and grab me. I was both fascinated and unsettled. Something about the doll's gaze seemed to pull me in, like it was waiting for me to make the first move. I couldn't resist. I asked the shopkeeper, an old man with a weathered face, about the doll. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to decide whether or not to speak. Finally, he said, "That one's not for sale, it's special. It's been with the shop for years." I was taken aback by his response. I had seen plenty of strange things in my life, but this doll felt different. I asked him why it was so special, but he just shook his head and muttered, "Some things are best left undisturbed." His words should have been a warning, but I didn't listen. I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll had some sort of power over me. It felt like it was calling me, like it wanted me to take it home. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't leave without it. I ended up purchasing the doll, much to the dismay of the shopkeeper, who seemed reluctant to let it go. He wrapped it up carefully and handed it to me, his hands trembling as he did. Before I left, he warned me one last time. "Whatever you do," he said, his voice low and strained, "don't let it out of your sight." I left the shop, shaking my head at the odd encounter. It was just a doll after all, but as I walked back to my hotel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a grave mistake. That night, as I sat in my room, the doll seemed to take on a life of its own. It sat on the chair across from me, its eyes never leaving mine. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt a chill creep up my spine. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't. The next morning, I awoke to find the doll had moved. It was no longer sitting in the chair where I had left it. Instead, it was perched on the edge of my bed, staring down at me with those unnervingly lifelike eyes. I could feel my heart race in my chest, my palms slick with sweat. It didn't make sense. I had locked the door before going to sleep. There was no way the doll could have moved on its own. From that moment on, things began to spiral out of control. Strange occurrences followed me everywhere I went. I would hear footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, no one was there. I would catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corner of my eye. And worst, all the doll kept showing up in places it shouldn't have been, on my bed, on the couch, in the bathroom. No matter how carefully I locked it away, it always found its way back. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. The doll's presence was suffocating. and the more I tried to distance myself from it, the more it seemed to draw me in. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that I was in the grip of something far darker than I had ever encountered. One night, after days of sleeplessness and paranoia, I decided to confront the doll. I grabbed it by the arms and stared into its cold, glassy eyes, demanding that it leave me alone. But as I looked deeper into its gaze, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The doll's face twisted, its once beautiful features contorting into a grotesque, snarling expression. Its eyes turned black, voids that seemed to suck in all the light around me. I stumbled backward, dropping the doll in shock. It hit the floor with a loud crack, but it didn't stop there. The doll seemed to twitch and jerk, as if something was trying to break free from within. The room grew colder, and the air thickened, making it hard to breathe. I could feel an oppressive force pushing down on me, like I was being suffocated by an unseen hand. The doll's voice echoed in my mind, soft at first, then louder and more insistent. "You shouldn't have brought me here. You shouldn't have disturbed me." In that moment, I realized the truth. The doll wasn't just cursed, it was alive. It had been waiting for someone to awaken it, to release the darkness it carried. And now that I had, there was no going back. I tried to leave the hotel, but the doors wouldn't open. The walls seemed to close in around me, trapping me in the room with the doll. I could feel its eyes on me, hear its whispers in my ears. It was too late. The curse had claimed me, and there was no escape. By the time the police arrived the next morning, they found the room in disarray. The doll was gone, and I was nowhere to be found. No one ever knew what happened to me, but those who stayed in that hotel after me reported strange occurrences, footsteps at night, eerie whispers in the halls, and sightings of a porcelain doll, its dark eyes following them wherever they went. And so the curse continues, passing from one person to the next, waiting for someone else to disturb it, to bring it back to life. The dollmaker's curse is never truly broken. It lingers, waiting, watching, and whispering to those who are foolish enough to listen. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when I found the old dollhouse at the estate sale. It had been tucked away in the corner of the basement, covered in dust and cobwebs. The sellers didn't seem to know much about it, only that it had been in the family for generations. They were practically giving it away, and something about it caught my eye. I had always been drawn to vintage items, especially those with a story behind them. The dollhouse was intricately detailed, with tiny furniture and miniature decorations that seemed to be from another time. It looked like a little replica of a grand old mansion with Victorian-style windows and a steeply pitched roof. The craftsmanship was amazing. Everything was so precise and lifelike. As I picked it up, I noticed a strange feeling in my chest. A sudden sense of unease washed over me, but I shrugged it off as just the odd feeling that sometimes accompanies an old object. I bought it for a steal and carried it home, unaware that my purchase would soon change my life forever. The first night I placed it in my living room, I couldn't stop staring at it. The dollhouse felt alive. Its dark wood and delicate details seemed to pulse with energy. I set it on a small table and admired the miniature furnishings, each piece arranged with care. I even added a few small figurines to populate the rooms, a little family to make it feel more complete. But as night fell, the unsettling feeling returned. There was something not quite right about the dollhouse. It wasn't until later that evening that I noticed the first strange thing. I was sitting on the couch watching TV when I heard soft footsteps coming from the direction of the dollhouse. I dismissed it as the creaking of the old house, but as I listened more closely, the footsteps grew louder. Hesitant, I stood up and walked toward the table. The tiny figurines that I had placed inside the house had moved. The little girl, who had been standing in the hallway of the second floor, was now sitting on the staircase. I was certain I hadn't moved them. I was careful to arrange them exactly where I wanted them, and they hadn't been touched since. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had just forgotten where I put them, or perhaps I had knocked them over without realizing it. But as the days went on, things got stranger. Objects in the dollhouse began to shift on their own. The curtains inside the miniature windows fluttered as if stirred by an unseen breeze. The family members would be found in different rooms, doing things I hadn't arranged them to do. The little girl would be sitting at the dining table one moment, then outside the front door the next. One night, I decided to watch the dollhouse closely. I sat in the darkened living room, staring at it across the room. At first, nothing happened. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. But after what seemed like hours, I saw a figure move. A shadow passed across one of the miniature windows. My heart skipped a beat. I leaned forward, straining to see. The curtains inside the dollhouse twitched again, and I could swear I saw the outline of a face pressed up against the window. It was the face of the little girl, except her eyes were black, hollow voids like she had no soul. I stumbled back, my breath quickening. That was when I realized it wasn't just the dollhouse that was strange, it was the whole room. The temperature had dropped significantly. A cold draft filled the air, carrying with it the scent of something rotten. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, stretching out like dark tendrils reaching toward the dollhouse. I couldn't look away, and a sense of dread gripped me like I had never experienced before. Suddenly, the tiny door to the dollhouse opened on its own. Slowly, creaking on its hinges as if it were inviting me inside. Without thinking, I walked toward it, compelled by some unseen force. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to see what was inside the house. I knelt down and peered through the open door, hoping to find some explanation for the strange happenings. But what I saw froze me in place. Inside, the rooms were no longer miniature. They were full-sized. The walls stretched out beyond the confines of the tiny house, and the figures that had once been plastic dolls were now people. They were moving around, walking from room to room, staring at cold, lifeless eyes. The little girl was standing at the top of the staircase, her eyes now completely black, her lips curling into a twisted grin. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, but no one was there. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up quickly, my legs shaking. The dollhouse was back to normal, the little figures sitting in their tiny rooms once again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something real, something beyond explanation. The air was thick with the sense that something had just crossed over from the dollhouse into my world. That night, the dreams began. They were vivid and terrifying, like I was living in a nightmare. In the dreams, I would find myself in the same dollhouse, trapped within its walls. The rooms would change shape and twist into dark, oppressive spaces, and I could hear whispers all around me. Sometimes I would be alone, wandering through empty rooms, and other times the family would be there. Their faces were blank, emotionless, except for the little girl who would follow me wherever I went. Her black eyes would never leave me, her grin growing wider with each passing moment. I started to avoid the dollhouse, leaving it in the corner of the room, untouched. But the house seemed to call to me, like a magnet pulling me back. I couldn't stop looking at it. Even when I left the house for work or errands, I would find myself rushing home, eager to check on it. The final straw came one evening when I returned home to find the dollhouse in the middle of the living room. I hadn't moved it, and I certainly hadn't placed it there. But there it was, sitting like a cursed thing in the center of the room. The little girl was gone, but the others, her mother, father, and brother, were all standing in the windows, staring at me. I rushed to the dollhouse, determined to put an end to whatever dark force had taken over it. As I reached for it, the doors of the dollhouse slammed shut, the walls shaking violently as if something inside was trying to break free. The house began to glow with an unnatural light, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from inside. Before I could react, the house exploded in a flash of blinding light. The force threw me backward and I hit the floor hard. The room went completely silent. When I opened my eyes, the dollhouse was gone, but I could still feel its presence in the room, like a lingering, oppressive force. The next day, I packed up and left the town. I couldn't stay there anymore. No one ever saw the dollhouse again, and I never spoke of it to anyone. But I know what I saw, and I know what happened. That dollhouse was more than just a toy. It was a portal, a gateway to something dark and twisted. And once it had your attention, it never let go. I don't know who created it or why, but I do know one thing. Some things are better left undisturbed. It started when my parents decided to renovate the house. The house had been in the family for generations, and though it was old, I had always felt safe there. Growing up, I had spent countless hours playing in the attic, a dusty, cluttered space where old furniture, boxes of forgotten memories, and antique treasures were stored. I had always felt a strange attachment to the attic, like it was my secret hideaway, where I could escape from the world below. One rainy afternoon, while my parents were away, I decided to explore the attic again. The rain pattered gently against the roof, and the wind howled outside, making the house feel colder than usual. I climbed up the narrow stairs and into the attic, the smell of old wood and dust filling the air. As I rummaged through a box of old family photographs, I stumbled upon something that caught my eye. A porcelain doll, its delicate features eerily beautiful. The doll was unlike any I had ever seen. Its dress was tattered, and its face was painted with an almost unsettling precision. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow me as I held it in my hands. I couldn't remember ever seeing it before, but I felt strangely drawn to it. It was small, delicate, and appeared to be centuries old. A small tag was sewn into its dress, but the writing was too faded to read clearly. Without thinking, I placed it in the corner of the attic, intending to ask my parents about it when they got home. But that night, as I was lying in bed, something strange happened. I heard soft footsteps, barely audible, coming from upstairs. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind or the house settling. But the footsteps continued, getting louder and closer, until I could hear them right outside my door. I hesitated before getting out of bed and quietly walking up to the attic. The air felt unnaturally cold, and the darkness inside the house seemed to grow thicker the closer I got. As I stepped into the attic, I froze. The porcelain doll was no longer in the corner where I had left it. Instead, it was sitting in the center of the room, positioned perfectly upright, as if waiting for me. I had no explanation for how it had moved, but I could feel my heart racing. The doll's eyes seemed to gleam in the moonlight that filtered through the attic window. I quickly grabbed it and placed it back in the corner, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But over the next few days, the strange occurrences intensified. Every time I would return to the attic, the doll had moved. Sometimes it was sitting in different places, other times it was standing up as though watching me. It wasn't just the doll. I would hear whispers in the dark corners of the attic, faint voices that seemed to call my name. I even started seeing shadows that flickered out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. One evening, as I was cleaning the attic, I found something buried beneath a pile of old blankets, a small, worn journal. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting inside was cramped and uneven. As I read through it, I discovered something chilling. The journal belonged to my great-great-grandmother, who had lived in the house many years ago. It described strange happenings similar to what I had been experiencing: the movement of objects, the whispering voices, and the feeling of being watched. One entry caught my attention. "The doll, she's awake again. I've seen her eyes move, her fingers twitch. They say she's cursed, but I didn't believe it. Now I do. It's too late to turn back now. I've tried to bury her, burn her, but she always returns. She watches me, waiting for something I can't understand. I fear the day she finally speaks." The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. The doll was not just an object, it was something more, something far darker than I could have imagined. I could feel its presence, even now, lurking in the shadows of the attic. It was alive in some way, and it wanted something from me. Desperate to rid myself of it, I decided to destroy the doll. I took it downstairs to the fireplace, intending to burn it. But as the flames roared to life, the doll began to emit a faint, high-pitched whimper, like a soft cry. The flames seemed to hesitate before licking at its porcelain surface. I threw the doll into the fire, but to my horror, the flames danced around it, as if the fire itself was avoiding the doll. Panicking, I grabbed the doll and ran outside, throwing it into the yard and dousing it with gasoline. I set it ablaze, hoping that the fire would finally consume it. But even as the flames grew higher, the doll's figure remained intact, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. It seemed to grin at me as though it had won. That night, I had the most vivid dream of my life. In the dream, I was back in the attic, standing before the doll. It was no longer in its usual state of stillness. It was moving, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it began to walk toward me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The doll reached out with its cold porcelain hand and placed it on my cheek. Its voice, a soft whisper, echoed in my mind. "You cannot escape me. I have always been here. You will never be free." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I could feel something watching me, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. The doll was gone from the attic, but its presence was still there, heavy and oppressive. The next morning, I went outside to find the remains of the doll in the yard. It was nothing more than a pile of ashes scattered in the wind. But even as I stared at the remnants, I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't truly been destroyed. It was still out there, somewhere, waiting to return. And I knew deep down that the doll would never truly be gone. It would always be watching, waiting for me. No matter where I went or what I did, I would never be free of its curse.